It's been an interesting week this week in the Lords for a variety of reasons. Because of the way the debates fell, on Monday I ended up with a short question on Islamophobia and two planned debates, one on whether trans women, natal-born men, should be in women's prisons, and another opposing the misogyny hate crime amendment, which obviously meant that on one day I was going to kind of fall foul of, half the population unintentionally. But I want to talk about the police and crime bill and what happened in relation to first of all, the discussion about where people are housed in prison. Hopefully you will have seen the speech, so I don't need to tell you what I was arguing. But what was really fascinating about that was a small amendment put forward by a couple of peers who I like to feel I helped contribute to by suggesting that it was a good idea in the first instance, and then it was organised, and then I wanted to support it, which I did. And it turned into what can only be described as a very toxic discussion and row about gender and biological sex. But the significant things for me were that I was infuriated by Shami Chakrabarti, Baroness Chakrabarti, who, in response to me or making a contribution, basically did this peculiar speech all about how she felt that this was being dragged into the culture wars. She then did a very weird analogy about people in lifts that involved something to do with white supremacists. So even if it wasn't what she was saying, we knew where we were going, and basically had a go at those people who were politicising the issue. And I suddenly realised that because COVID restrictions have gone, that I didn't have to just listen to this, that I could jump up. And I jumped up. But I forgot the rules of the House, and so I started saying the thing about what you're saying, and then I realised that you're not allowed to directly address people as you in the House of Lords, so I then changed it to the Noble Baroness Chakrabarti. But basically it was a bit of a fight, and it was really useful, not because of the fight, but because I was able to clarify that actually none of us who were putting forward this amendment were remotely interested in the culture wars. We were genuinely interested in the prisoner question, and it was perfectly legitimate for us to do it, and that maybe somebody who'd referred to, cis women was somebody playing the culture wars game as Shami was in that instance. That happened, and then later on, Lord Paddock, who is the ex-police chief, who is Lib Dem front bench spokesperson, he stood up and started saying, very sympathetically, particularly to me, I used to think like that as well, but then I met some trans people, and then I heard their plight. Again, I was seething, and then I thought, I can jump up. So I jumped up, and so I had to run in with him, because I pointed out that it was rather patronising to assume that the rest of us had never met any trans people, or that he was speaking on behalf of trans people, and so I was able to clarify that. I don't know that it did me any favours in relation to the minister, who was very sharp in his response, but I thought, I'm beginning to see why, when you have the committee stage of a debate, of a piece of legislation going through, where you're meant to go through it line by line, as it were, you're allowed to intervene quite a lot, and you could actually, it was a genuine, proper row discussion, and it's had an influence, because since that happened in the House of Lords, and really only because of it, the issue of trans people in prisons has been covered by quite a lot of the media. So it formed the basis of a discussion on Politics Live on the BBC. It's been covered by GB News and Talk Radio, as you might expect. I've seen it in newspapers. I saw that I was quoted in one of the newspapers, and my speech was quoted. So it's actually, if you want, a good thing to remind myself that you can actually make a bit of a difference. No, I'm not saying that the House of Lords is a good thing. I'm simply saying, well, I'm there, I might as well try and make a difference, as we know. The other thing was that we then went on to discuss the misogyny as a hate crime amendment. This, by the way, was at about midnight. Everybody was in a very bad mood that we were still there, because everything had dragged on. And in preference to people making the usual set-piece speeches that they were doing, everyone said, we haven't got much time, so I'll just make a couple of points. And I made a terrible error of judgment, which is I thought, maybe I should just cut my speech. So I started faffing around, and as a consequence of which, I made my first point about how you couldn't have a misogyny hate crime bill if you don't know what a woman is. Again, available on all good YouTube channels. But also, I was interrupted. This was quite funny because the Lord who interrupted me said, would I take him? I said yes. And then I stood up, and then there was a lot of noise, and I didn't know what it was. And of course, I was meant to sit down, whereas I was just standing up listening to him. And then eventually I realised I'd made a faux pas, so eventually I sat down, and they treated me, it was one of those sit down, like, you idiot type of thing. Anyway, eventually I did it. He then made some sarcastic comment, which I came back on, doesn't matter what the exchange was. But he was unpleasant, but it was fine, because that's what debates are like, and I coped very well. But then he completely threw me, and because I'd abandoned my speech, I ended up just saying, in response to him, who had told me, he'd said that I needed to talk to lots of police chiefs. And funnily enough, a few years ago, I did talk to a lot of police chiefs about hate crime, and I made the point that it was a 50-50 split. But I then said the police should be allowed to get on with the real problem of violence against women and girls. What I didn't do was I didn't make a very important point, which was the whole premise of this discussion is that young women and girls are facing misogynistic hatred, violence everywhere they go. And I wanted to say, and it's an important point to clarify here, that it should be the job of legislators not to use hyperbole, not to kind of conjure up images of fear, but to reassure, to use the law appropriately, but not to use it, actually, as Shami said, not to use it to hype up problems, but to take a cool, hard look at what women face, and to recognise that by the rhetoric that was being used about violence against women and girls, that what they were implying was that every young woman was facing this all the time, and that this was something they should be frightened of. And of course, as Ella Whelan has always consistently pointed out, if you want to know what's really going to jeopardise young women's freedom, it's fear, because they'll be frightened to go out. And I wanted to make that point, and I didn't, and it was annoying. So the thing that I've learned is to not lose my nerve, stick with the speech that I've carefully crafted and written, even if other people say they're only going to speak briefly. Because, by the way, after me, about 3 people made very long set-piece speeches, and we didn't get out till 12:20, right? So I should have stuck with what I was going to say. Just on the police and crime bill then, it's dragging on because of this line-by-line thing, and the government can't really do much about it because that's the rules and they have to do it, but it's taking much longer than it should do. So it was meant to have finished last night. We haven't even got to the contentious issues around the banning on protests and demonstrations yet. So they've warned us that it'll be a very long day on Monday. I'll be in the chamber till midnight, and then on Wednesday it has to finish no matter what. And as somebody said to me, and if it's 5 in the morning, it's 5 in the morning. So I could be doing speeches at any goodness knows when. But obviously we'll make sure that I'm there to argue against the attacks on the freedom to demonstrate and the freedom to protest. So that's kind of been interesting. I've learnt some stuff that way. I've also had a lot of meetings this week, and I suppose I've found that quite productive. I've had a couple of discussions and meetings face-to-face with people about the up-and-coming academic freedom bill, and got advice on the kind of amendments I might put in. And also there was a cross-party parliamentary group Zoom meeting on academic freedom bill, which I actually spoke at, intervened in, and feel like I'm getting a handle on how I'm going to do that, because that will be the first time I will have my name on any amendments, and it's due to come up in the new year, I think, rather than any other time. But that's very important. The other thing is that I've had people come in for meetings on discussing a academic trip to Israel, potentially on sport and the culture wars, which will be interesting, which I'll be involved in, and also had a shout out, if I can, to Nick and Michael Hollick, who came in for a cup of tea and coffee and made me see the Lords in a new way, because they were so sort of impressed with its history and its beauty and all the rest of it. And I thought, I just take all this for granted these days, and I really need to do a history tour so I understand the place. But in the course of that, we came up with the idea of having a discussion on opera and its relevance for next year's Battle of Ideas. So that was really exciting, and I've had a number of meetings with I've been lobbied, if you want, by other members of the Lords about bills that they were raising. So I found that really interesting, and so I feel as though it's been a productive time. I'm about to go in now because Lord Frost has got a number of questions and the Remainers are on full alert, and they're about to use the Northern Irish Protocol to argue that European Court of Justice should have jurisdiction over Northern Ireland. I'm going to argue against that. And and it's the first time I've actually spoken when Lord Frost questions are there, so I'll enjoy that. And the final thing was, just inadvertently yesterday, I happened upon a question. This is the sort of thing that happens now that there aren't as many rules, and I like it. There was an emergency question on the Liverpool bombing, and I wasn't going to speak because I didn't expect it. I was kind of thinking about something else. And then I realised that nobody had mentioned at all, Islamicism or terrorism even. There were some good questions, I think, on illegal refugees in the country, and it's a tricky one, and nobody wants. But it's a reasonable question in view of the circumstances. But then there was one question which basically asked for the government to reassure them that they wouldn't stir up any antagonism to the Muslim community, and that we had to reassure them. And I just got mad, and I managed to jump up and say, for goodness sake, you need to reassure everybody, Muslim and everybody else, about Islamicist terrorism, extremists who do not represent ordinary Muslims, who do not represent ordinary people in the UK, but being told we're not allowed to discuss it in case we offend a particular community is a very dangerous way to go. Paternalistic, condescending, and dangerous genuinely, because we need to know what we're facing. And it might well be that this guy from Liverpool was not radicalised, but we do know that something is going on. And I mentioned David Amess, an MP who was killed by somebody who was radicalised, murdered, and it happened. We discussed it for 3 days, never mentioned subsequently. So I will carry on next week to try and raise as much as possible that goes against the grain, not to be contrarian, because that's a very important point, but to just sometimes raise questions that I know people are talking about in the pub, in their living rooms, and don't have a chance to get an answer for, and I will make sure that I try and give voice to those things.